just to tell you a little bit more about myself and how LIFT got started. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. I grew up in a very comfortable middle-class existence, a very loving environment. My parents had done the really hard first-generation work of being the firsts in their families to go to college and to exit the small towns that they were in and to establish a really wonderful existence for my parents and myself. And I was raised by two public servants, as Ron mentioned, wonderful people, a longtime public school educator, teacher, and principal as a mom, and a public servant in the military and then Defense Department working on arms control policy as a father. And my mom in particular always infused me with this sense that no matter how comfortable we might feel our lives are, the fact is that we're all still teetering on the edge. And that were it not for luck and some positive turns of event, good fortune, the people around us, we all could fall right off that cliff. And that we have an obligation, each one of us, to help keep people from falling off the cliff because someday we're going to need saving too. And so these would be, I call these my social justice tuck-ins that I got from my mom. I now think about this as a mom. How am I going to infuse this spirit in my child? But there's this real sense of don't get too comfortable. Don't rest on your laurels, and certainly don't feel entitled, because so much of how we ended up in this privileged place was a sheer matter of good fortune and luck. Yes, hard work, but we need to acknowledge that wasn't all of it. So I took that spirit with me, was very involved in service, probably like all of you here in high school. I had a great opportunity when I was a senior in high school. I think as an antidote to senioritis, my high school came up with these things called senior projects. Some friends were doing yoga, others were learning pottery. I decided that I was interested in child advocacy based on having done some community service work, but feeling like it wasn't very meaningful, feeling it was a little bit like cheap grace service work where I was showing up periodically and not making a big difference. And so I wanted to learn more about systems and structures. This was in around 1997, a year after welfare reform had been passed, so that was the policy backdrop of what was happening my senior year in high school. And because I was in Washington, D.C., I was fortunate enough to be able to design a project where I spent half of my time working in the office of the president of the Children's Defense Fund, who is the extraordinary Marian Wright Edelman, civil rights leader extraordinaire and someone that you should all know about, and got to spend then the other half of my time serving as an assistant teacher at a Head Start program for predominantly homeless families in DC, getting a kind of deep on the ground experience with a little bit of a sense of the policy backdrop of what was happening. And I thought that I was going to follow in the footsteps of Marian and become a child advocate, and that this would be my inauguration into the field. What happened to me over the course of those couple of months that led me to then decide to defer my other plans and stay for many, many more months working in the Head Start program before I started college was that as much as I enjoyed working with the children in the Head Start program, I became very, very connected to the parents of those kids. And one of the things I was struck by was just, so in this particular program, all of the families had to technically qualify as homeless in order to even be able to receive services. And just to qualify for homelessness in DC is a pretty awful, arduous process. I was talking with Molly and Victoria about that. They experienced it this summer. So you had to qualify to be homeless. And it was so interesting because I felt that even amongst the teachers that I was working with, who I had great admiration for, there was this sense, though, that the parents were the enemy. And the parents were to be avoided at all costs, and that the role of the one social worker for the several hundred families who were in this program was to essentially isolate the kids from their parents. And I had a pretty different experience. Now, I was naive, what did I know? But what I experienced was, for the most part, really exceptional people who, despite the toughest of circumstances, literally living in homelessness, were finding a way to bring their kids to school every day, were searching for jobs, were trying to navigate their way through the social services system while there was this seismic shift happening for many of them in their public benefits given welfare reform. And, no one would take them seriously. And so I'm sure I violated all sorts of rules and such, but after hours, kind of vigilante style, I started just working with some of the parents, doing simple things, because again, I was a senior in high school. I wasn't claiming to have any great skills, but it was the early days of the internet. I knew how to use the internet and email to navigate resources. I knew how to write a resume. I'd just gone through the college application process and was really good at presenting myself as well as I could possibly present myself. I had some foreign language skills, so I could provide some translation services and accompany people to appointments. And I started to find that these seemingly very, very small things, like helping someone write a resume, or accompanying them to an appointment so they wouldn't have to be by themselves, or really just listening and asking questions like, what are your strengths and dreams and aspirations? Questions that they hadn't heard before seemed to make a big difference in their lives. And so, I did this work, and then eventually I did have to go to college. So I went off to Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, which is kind of the ultimate ivory tower in the midst of a fairly depleted urban area, although it's been gentrified a lot since I left Yale. But when I got there, the divide between kind of the town and the gown, the city and the university, was pretty extreme. And so I got really involved in social justice and community service work, all of which was really geared towards kids. And I went through the same process of feeling like there was a lot of support that these families needed as well. And if we really wanted to shift the needle for kids, we had to also focus on family stability, like stable housing, employment, other types of resources for parents. And so I started with a couple of friends, just working directly with families. And from there, started to get to know some of the amazing service providers, public interest lawyers, social workers, and others in the New Haven community. And the head of the YMCA in New Haven, which mostly ran childcare programs, had seen me coming in advocating one-on-one for some families for childcare, which is such a critical support that families need. And he said, I've noticed you. And it's not very often that we see students coming around here working with families. Have you ever thought about taking this one-woman thing you're doing and turning it into a program? Because we could use more of your colleagues and your peers in this community. And I'll tell you what, if you do this and if you succeed, I'll help you and I'll give you office space. On the second floor of his building, the whole first floor was a childcare program. So I thought about it and got together some friends at the time, including my boyfriend at the time, who was a ready co-founder for me. This is how we do things, right? We use the network that we have. And decided to try to turn this very simple model of just connecting people, forming relationships, hearing their needs, and helping them achieve their own goals into a program. And that's really how Lift started. Within the first 3 months of our work in New Haven, we were there in the YMCA Child Care Center on the second floor working with their parents and others. But within 3 months, we had helped 100 people. We'd seen some extraordinary successes. We'd seen, our colleagues. We got together a cohort of about 50 fellow students who we trained up with the help of community social workers, lawyers, and others who were accompanying clients to court, who were helping people find employment, who were restoring dignity. And so, of course, we thought, well, hey, we've got to take this thing national, right? I'm sure this would qualify as statistically significant. 100 clients over 3 months. This is ready to be a national model. And so if we were going to be a national model, we had to find a way to get ourselves to DC, it felt like. That was the epicenter of policy and welfare reform was happening. And we needed to get to the president and ask the president for money to scale this model, right? I mean, how else would a sophomore in college think that you needed to scale a program? Well, we needed the president to give us $1 million so we could do it. So, crazily enough, that's what we managed to do. And this is in 1999. We had started our first program in New Haven in January of 1999. This is in August of 1999. That's good old Bill Clinton in the middle. That's me making kind of a funny face there, and a whole group of early LIFT volunteers. And we had heard that the president was focusing on welfare reform, but also on national service through AmeriCorps. And we felt like this model that we had created was kind of this love child of national service and his interests in welfare reform. And so we started basically through letter writing campaigns stalking all of the people around Clinton that we heard were working on welfare reform and national service, sending endless numbers of letters, making our case. And I think until finally we were just persistent enough that we got a call from an extraordinary guy, he's now deceased, named Eli Siegel, who was the founding CEO of AmeriCorps and running something called the Welfare to Work Partnership for President Clinton. And I think he just, for whatever reason, this group of college kids getting involved in these very non-sexy issues seemed intriguing to him. So he invited us to Washington that summer as we were continuing our work in New Haven, and let us know that August that President Clinton, as kind of one of his final salvos, was going to be having a big Welfare to Work conference in Chicago with Mayor Daley and the head of UPS and everyone, as kind of a last hurrah before he left office, and asked if we might like to attend. And we said, sure, and can we bring 30 of our summer interns? Because that's how we were staffed. We had no money, we had no staff. And we got these bright blue Audacious t-shirts printed, and we road tripped from DC to Chicago with 30 of us. You can't imagine how many McDonald's bags. It was when McDonald's was running its, the Monopoly game. And so we thought, road trip from DC to Chicago, 30 college kids, we should be able to get the $1 million just from our McDonald's Monopoly. So that didn't work out. But we wore these ostentatious blue t-shirts and tried to find ourselves wherever Clinton was speaking. And lo and behold, he was, I think, intrigued enough by who these kids were at this Welfare to Work conference in blue t-shirts that he invited us to come talk to him after one of our sessions. We brought him a t-shirt, and we said, we've started this model. We think it's something really powerful. We need funding to do it. It feels like the government should fund this. Can you give us $1 million? This is where brazen naivete is one of the most important assets in entrepreneurship. And he said, well, sorry about that. He said, I've got a buddy in Congress. His name is John Porter. He's a moderate Republican, and he's from the Illinois area. This sounds like it might be up his alley. He chairs the Labor, Health, and Human Services Appropriations Subcommittee, and he's also about to leave, and I think this is the kind of mark he might want to leave. Tell him I told you to go see him and ask about some Department of Labor ETA discretionary money. And we said, okay. So we go back to DC thinking, how do we get to John Porter? So we start faxing. Again, this is still 99. Things aren't quite as automated. We start faxing these photos with Clinton saying, he said we should come see you to ask about $1 million. John Porter saw us. Again, lo and behold, I don't know how we did it. And fast forward to 2001, and we ended up getting $1 million grant from the Department of Labor to really take LIFT to scale. It's a very rare and unusual story of how Uncle Sam essentially provided the growth capital for this model. But the point of this is not to say that you all need to stalk the president, although why not, if you've got something good to get done. But the moral of this is to say that no matter what your skills, no matter what your level of preparedness, you decide when it's your moment to seize the day and accomplish what you want to accomplish. And we all have the opportunity to build great things, to support great initiatives. It's just whether or not we get in our own ways. And sometimes what you don't know is your greatest asset, because certainly if I knew what I knew now, I would never have started this organization. I would have been way too freaked out. So fast forward to today, and Lyft has seriously professionalized our game, as hopefully Victoria and Molly can speak to. About 15 years after that time, we have grown the organization to 6 major cities across the country: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, DC, Chicago, and now LA. We've got about 80 people on staff, an army of over 1,000 volunteer advocates working with us, and we've supported over 100,000 families now in pursuing their goals and charting a path out of poverty. And what we've undertaken in the last 2 years, I want to tell you a little bit more about, because I think it'll illuminate some of the insights that I think nonprofits can bring into policy conversations or research conversations. So just to tell you a little bit more about the core Lyft model. So the model is still rooted in volunteerism. The majority of our volunteer advocates remain college undergraduate students and grad students, although increasingly we're bringing in professionals, retirees, and former clients. We pair up highly trained and committed volunteer advocates like Victoria and Molly, and we partner them with community members. We call them members versus clients, to build a relationship with one another. That's the first critical step in what we do. And in particular, it's a relationship that is client-led, that's goal-oriented, that's strengths-based, and we can talk more about that in Q&A if you'd like. That's holistic, so it's comprehensive, and most importantly, that's rooted in dignity and respect. And this might sound fluffy or aspirational, but these really are the core tenets of how we do what we do and how we carry out our work every day. Then together, member and advocates partner to make progress on that member's self-identified goals. So key areas are in housing, education, and employment, but they could go beyond that as well. And ultimately, what we're trying to do is to help people build not only the financial, but also the personal and social foundations that they need to lift themselves and their families out of poverty. And we say out of poverty for good because that's what we should be working towards, a sustainable, multi-generational change. What I want to focus on a little bit more is this last piece of the model. So when we think about poverty in America, in so many ways, the definition of being poor, it's just an income-based definition based on a poverty line established by social scientists and policymakers that we've agreed upon. And that's what poor means. And so most of the metrics that we have to define whether or not people are poor are strictly financial metrics. And absolutely, we're very focused on helping people create great financial gains, try to move themselves towards the middle class, expand their family incomes, get public benefits, get stable employment, et cetera. But interestingly, when we just 2 years ago embarked on a strategic planning process where we did a longitudinal assessment of about 20,000 families that had worked with us over the course of many years, who had achieved major shifts in family circumstances and household incomes, employment stability, housing stability, childcare stability, and healthcare stability. That's what we were looking at. And these were gains that families had sustained for at least 2 years after working with us. When we did both quantitative and qualitative research that we commissioned with those families, what we wanted to find out was what, for the highest performing families, again, who had achieved those great successes that they'd sustained, what would they identify about their experience with Lyft that had most helped them accelerate that change and sustain that change over time? So we did, again, a lot of number crunching, but then we did really incredible focus groups and interviews with families. And interestingly, we were expecting people to give us feedback on the housing placement services and the job placement services and the public benefits enrollment, and EITC enrollment services, and other things that we provide as being what the accelerants were. What was fascinating was that every single person that we interviewed said that the single most important thing that Lyft had done for them to accelerate their ultimately financial progress was to treat them with dignity when they first walked into our center. And that the way that they were received in our centers by our volunteer advocates, most of whom are students like you, was with such kindness and open-mindedness and a focus on their strengths that they had never experienced before. And it gave them such a surge of confidence that it made them want to keep coming back. It made them believe that it was worth it to pursue what might be a really long job search for a pretty low-wage job, or a really long housing search, because they were in an environment that was affirming. And then when we talked about, well, what helped you sustain your successes when inevitably you hit bumps in the road down the line? And how did Lift help you with that? What people were most likely to identify were a whole set of social aspects. If we're going to say that, I talked some about confidence boosting, personal aspects and such. But then there was a whole set of social aspects around how Lift had helped to create a community around people at a time often of tremendous extreme isolation in their own lives. And that some of the work that we've done that we've stolen from business schools like Harvard Business School and others of power mapping and social networking that are typically used for elites, we've now brought into our practices in our Lift offices. And that the work that we had done to help people map their networks and understand their support structures was critical when they hit that inevitable bump in the road. They lost their child care, someone got sent to jail, there was an unplanned pregnancy, whatever it might have been, that the critical factor that kept people from falling off the cliff was whether in that moment they felt they had someone to turn to ask for help, and whether they felt empowered enough to ask for help. So we thought, wow, no one has yet talked about money or our financially related services. Everything that people want to talk about kind of fall in these personal and social domains. So we've really started to develop this hypothesis that we're hoping to test over the next several years, that part of what's missing from our conversation around poverty alleviation in this country, because it's actually more active in other countries, this focus on empowerment and social capital. But in this country, we're not talking enough about all three of these foundational dimensions that allow people to achieve success. So let me tell you an example of someone that we've worked with. Meet Angela Allen. She's one of the 100,000 remarkable people that Lift has worked with over the last 15 years. And when she first came into contact with Lift Philadelphia 3.5 years ago, Angela was in the midst of a pretty bitter separation. She was also in the throes of a terrible, terrible battle with cancer. And because of her health issues, she had lost her job, and consequently, the home that she had raised her children in had gone into foreclosure. So she, her entire axis had been thrown off. And she was, in her own words, completely lost and alone. She was walking around her neighborhood in West Philadelphia, and she happened to see our big, huge billboard that says Lift with that logo you saw. She didn't know what we did, but she said, I sure need a lift. And so she came into our offices. She was paired up with one of our advocates. We worked with her, a whole team of advocates worked with her for 3.5 years, and fast forward to today. And Angela is cancer-free. We helped her navigate an incredibly hairy and complex set of healthcare interventions to get the support that she needs, but she's cancer-free. We were able to help her restructure her mortgage, refinance her home, and keep her home. So we helped her avoid homelessness, which was the critical first goal. And she has now found a salaried position with benefits working at Mercy Hospital as a patient advocate with people just like her. And she's also hugely civically engaged. She's her neighborhood block captain, and she is an advocate with Lift, helping to spread the word around the community to bring more people in. When we talked to Angela about what was it over those 3.5 years that most helped her achieve her success, because we provided a lot of tangible services for sure, she will always say it was the way that she was treated. And sadly, she had never been treated with kindness in a social services context before. It was the fact then also that she was just so isolated. And she says her isolation, not some lack of innate skills, was what was keeping her from making progress. Lift advocates were the first people who went to see her in the hospital when she had a recurrence of her cancer in the course of those 3.5 years. And Lyft advocates created a social network for her that made her want to keep from giving up. Our experience in our Lyft offices is that every day the sad reality is that for the most part, our clients, when they're trying to navigate their way through the social services system that was theoretically set up to help them, the treatment that they receive is just brutal. It's just awful. And we've got all our anti-poverty programs spread across well over 6 agencies. They're still not coordinated. Eligibility restrictions come into conflict with one another. You've got to take bus after bus. You've got to just at every turn be made to feel terrible. And so frequently when Lyft clients come in to start working with us, they are just so worn down, ironically, by the process of trying to get help to move themselves forward. And so we, given that, have thought, you know, there is actually a lot that we've learned, we think, that's really credible, about how it is that we could conceive of a human-centered approach to help people navigate their way out of poverty. And we can't sit on the sidelines as direct service providers and nonprofits and not think about the opportunities for systemic change or practice change or policy change that could come from the learnings of our work. So we, as we've been building out our strategy for the next couple of years, have been thinking about how does an organization like Lyft start to really wade into the influence arena, the systemic influence arena, beyond continuing to provide exceptional direct service and wanting to grow and evolve that direct service and measure it more and more and more rigorously all the time. We also believe we have an obligation to try to shift the system. And so what we're focusing on in our strategy now is thinking of how do our Lyft offices in 6 cities across the country really serve as demonstration models for different ways that we could be thinking about designing our social services system. We're still in a very experimental phase, but we have some early thoughts on how it is that we might be able to elevate, most importantly, the voices and experiences of our own members to shape the system, which in so many, if you have to navigate the social services system, and hopefully you all will go through a simulation I'm going to tell you about at some point that we design, there's nothing about our design of our human services system that maps to how human beings operate as interconnected, complex beings. And so we want to think of how we can be more actively elevating the insights of our work, sharing our data, helping to convene thought leaders, to have boots on the ground experiences to better understand our own clients. We're doing some pretty cutting edge evaluation work using a constituent voice model, which is rigorously collecting the perceptual data of our own clients about their own progress that we can triangulate against our kind of objective economic measures. And we think that in a era where we're focusing so much on data and what works, too often we leave out client voice in the way that we evaluate things. We'd like to help the field look at that. And then we want to think about how we could reimagine practices using customer service, using technology, and all of that to actually create a better experience for poor people trying to get ahead. I want to show you a brief video about one, again, early influence experiment that we have, which is this simulation called Lyftopolis that many of our students and members themselves designed for us as an internal training tool. So when we train our volunteer advocates, there's a fair amount of experiential training we put them through. And again, some of our members and advocates decided to create this reconstruction of the social service experience that our clients have to navigate called Lyftopolis. And just a year ago, after 10 years of using this as an internal tool with the support of a funder in Boston, we decided to start experimenting with putting policymakers, city officials, and major philanthropists through Lyftopolis as a starting point for a conversation of even low-hanging fruit ways in which we could start to change the system. It's still early days, but a couple of cool things that came out of this experiment with those 150 funders, who, mind you, are all anti-poverty funders. So we weren't sure what kind of impact this would have, and I can't tell you the number of people who came up to me afterwards and said, you know, I've got a stack of white papers this high on my desk around, you know, access and coordination of benefits or other things like that, and this experience has compelled me to want to act. So we did this idea creation session. 70% of the ideas that came out had to do with technology, and one of the mistakes we made was we didn't have technology providers in the room. So we're about to do a Liftopolis in LA with hackers and gamers and others, as well as city officials. But hey, good hackers for good. But three things that I can tell you came out of this Liftopolis last November. The one is that the head of the Department of Transitional Assistance, which oversees cash assistance and what remains of welfare programs and such in Boston, wants to work with us to establish kind of a whole new customer service training protocol for their frontline workers. The other is that the head of the Housing Authority wants to work to streamline their more than 30 different forms for housing into one form. And then the third is that we're working with the Chief Technology Officer's office and the Office of New Urban Mechanics in City Hall to build the support to bring Code for America to Boston. It's an awesome organization bringing coders and, again, hackers into government change to build apps that could respond to the ideas that came out of Liftopolis. So these might seem like small changes, but the point is that change is possible in an environment that we so often think of as intractable. So what do we do with all of this? I want to kick it back to you all. You all have been eyewitnesses this summer over the last 2 months to the very real experiences that people living in poverty or close to poverty are having, and more importantly, I hope, to just the strength and resilience and great potential and capabilities that those people possess, contrary to what remain really pervasive welfare queen style stereotypes that we have in this country, despite the fact that, as you learned this morning, welfare basically doesn't exist anymore. But if you think back just recently to our not so long ago presidential election, we had conversations about moochers and the food stamps president and the 47% and all of that. And so, our rhetoric's still pretty bad around these issues, and that's a huge part of why we haven't made enough change. What happens in Washington, where I live, and Ron lives, and others, is that we can get so far removed from what's going on the ground, and there's this huge divide between the people making the policy and the people who have actually worked in the field building relationships. And that's what you have done. And so I would love for you to think about how you could channel your on-the-ground eyewitness experiences. You haven't been listening to lectures all summer. You have been doing the work into actually engaging discussions about systems change. One thing, I got this great quote from Molly and Victoria that I had to take down and share when I was asking them what one of their main takeaways from the summer was. And they said, the main thing we feel that we took away from our experience was the idea that people are the solution. Poverty isn't something we can solve by throwing money at it from afar. Poverty is best addressed with human interaction, compassion, and consideration. That's not how most policy debates play out when we're talking about anti-poverty policy in this country. We forget that we're talking about other human beings just like us. And so I think you all can be on the vanguard of a next wave of this movement. I am optimistic about the change that we can create. I'm totally optimistic about what you guys can do as disruptors, going into fields beyond just policy, but as technology providers and others, to rethink the ways that we can expand opportunity in this country and for all. And I want to thank you all for your extraordinary service this summer, including some of you to Lift directly, but really to this movement at large. We all have the capacity to lift people for good, and you all have taken a critical first step in that direction this summer. So thank you.